Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, with the Trump administration taking office in 2 weeks, what does it mean for the economy overall and your wallet? President Trump is promising to cut taxes and leverage heavy tariffs on imports. What impact might that have on the cost of goods, gas, utilities, groceries? And what will the new year bring in interest rates? Is another Federal Reserve rate cut in our future, or will the feds hold back? Tonight we have two economic experts on the show to discuss it all. But first, we'd like to hear from you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook. You can email us. You can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guest tonight, Chris Douglas, economics professor with the University of Michigan-Flint. He's in the studio as a regular here. Good to see you, Chris.
Always great to be here, Mike.
And Shay Manawar joins us virtually. He's with the Lansing Economic Development Corporation. He is a development specialist. Nice to have you both here tonight. So looking at your crystal balls, what does the future hold economically with President Trump taking the oath of office in 2 weeks? Okay, here are the highlights of what he's talking about. He's talking about leveraging tariffs and imports, reducing or ending taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security, maybe extending his robust 2017 tax cuts and jobs plan. In the midst of an economic climate where the federal debt is through the roof and questions about what the Federal Reserve might do with interest rates. So a lot on the economic plate. Let's go one at a time. I guess I'm going to start with tariffs. He's taking aim largely at China, Mexico, Canada as well. Do you think he's going to follow through? And if so, what impact might that have on the economy? Chris, I'll start with you.
So he threatened a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports. So there are a couple of issues with that. First, a tariff of that size would have real economic consequences for the United States. So if we think about what caused the stock market to crash before the Great Depression, that was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a tariff on a similar size. That was for Western Europe at the time. President Trump really cares a lot about the stock market. He tweets about it all the time. So if he really cares about the stock market, I think that would cause him not to go full force with a tariff of that size. I think a lot of the tariffs he's threatening are for leverage against foreign countries who displease him for various reasons. We kind of saw that with Canada. The Trudeau government fell. I think it had trouble before that, but maybe that 25% tariff was the final nail in the coffin. So the U.S. economy is the largest economy in the world. So if the largest economy in the world is threatening tariffs that will both impact us and impact the foreign country is going to respond. So I think a lot of the tariff talk is for foreign policy aims as much as it is for purported economic aims.
So Shay, do you see him posturing, kind of a way to just kind of blow some smoke before he takes office, or do you think it's a real threat? And if he does come through on that, I mean, doesn't that affect maybe the cost of goods? Because abroad, they might, the cost of producing things abroad might be a little higher, and that's passed on to us, right?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because let's prepare multiple scenarios. The scenario is that he's just threatening as one of the possible ways to leverage foreign policy. Let's just think of that as one scenario. If that's the case, then just because it's a second term and it's not a consecutive second term, so other countries are also prepared with other possible solutions that they may have. So the question is if the net impact of any of the tariffs that he may have is going to have an impact on the U.S. consumers, especially U.S. consumers' pockets, as you mentioned earlier in the show, coming out of COVID. His previous experience with tariffs was before COVID, when there was some appetite to take some blow on pockets or consumer pockets if there were any impact on the cost of living. But this time around, after COVID, after high inflation, I think the appetite to go through another cycle of high pricing on consumer goods may not be the best thing that voters from both sides would like to see. But the question is he using as a tool to raise revenues for the federal government? If that's the case, then I think it is one of the tools that many countries have been using outside of the U.S. And it does increase revenues for the governments, but it also comes with an impact. But the question is, does he understand the impact, especially on states like Michigan that has gone through a phase where the impact of tariffs were felt by agriculture community? And if that's the case, then I think it will be an interesting year or so.
Yeah, like Chris, I think you and I talked. I mean, how would tariffs, if they're implemented, sort of impact Michigan, the labor market, auto manufacturing particularly, would not probably bode well.
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind what the U.S. imports. I think there's a perception that the U.S. imports lots of consumer goods from foreign countries, and that's not really the case. If you look at a top 10 list of U.S. imports, there's only really two types of consumer goods on that list: automobiles, which I think is third, and then furniture, which is mixed in with another category. Both the U.S. largely imports are things like machines, raw materials, minerals, oil, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, things that are really used in the production process in the United States. So levying tariffs on U.S. imports is going to hurt domestic manufacturers if that raises their cost of inputs, which makes them less competitive on global markets and makes products to consumers more expensive. And what's also important to keep in mind is trade is a two-way street. If the United States imports something, well, someone has to pay for that by exporting something. So if you look at a top 10 list of exports, automobiles are on that list too. So if you reduce the number of imports, by definition that reduces exports, which hurts manufacturers like the domestic three automakers who do sell their cars on world markets.
Historically, I can't remember the last time we saw a president, an administration, implement tariffs. Can you guys recall it all? And if so, what was the reaction and the impact?
So
Go ahead, Shay.
I'll let Professor take.
Yeah, the last big tariff bill was the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It was signed
Okay.
into law by President Hoover back in 1929.
Okay.
He didn't want to sign it into law, but he made a campaign promise to do it. So against the advice of his economic advisors, he signed it into a law. It was a big tariff increase across lots of European countries. They retaliated by levying tariffs against U.S. goods. That's something to keep in mind too, that if the United States levies tariffs against China, like we saw the first Trump administration, they turn around to levy tariffs against us, and that's what Shay was talking about with Michigan agricultural industry, that if there are tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports are levied into retaliation, that hurts us. But the Smoot-Hawley tariff, it was a total disaster. International trade dried right up. We get the big stock market crash, and off we go to the Great Depression. And Smoot-Hawley was such a disaster that Congress decided that they were never going to touch tariff policy again, and they gave that power to the presidency, which is why President Trump could change tariffs unilaterally without going through Congress.
There you go. Shay, I don't know if you got more to say about that?
Absolutely, and I'm interesting that Professor mentioned about presidential power in terms of imposing tariffs. It was not the case. Let's just say 100, 150 years ago, Congress had a big say, but then the powers somewhat shifted more towards the president. But if you look at the U.S. history, the tariffs played a huge role in the beginning years of the country, all through Civil War, and then from Civil War there was a second phase of tariffs. I think if Trump does bring back significant tariffs, we might as well enter into the fourth phase of tariffs in the U.S. history. The very last one, especially after World War II, the concept changed about how to look at tariffs as a tool. The idea that was promoted by many economists and at the government level was that how about we let other countries specialize, especially emerging economies, specialize in certain products, certain sectors. We will help them produce those products, export to the outside world, and we will import those products by keeping our tariffs low, so that we can have other countries specialize in certain areas and we will specialize in one. I think what happened was, especially after NAFTA, was that by doing so, there were a lot of jobs that got shipped overseas, and that started to have an impact on the U.S. job market, a household's ability to make a living and then maintain their lifestyle for multiple generations. I think now we have seen enough evidence that there was an impact on that. Uh, Hence, we would see some sort of tariffs. But one big aspect of that tariff policy would be if we can, at the same time, establish U.S. ability to produce the amount of goods and products that we are no longer willing to buy from overseas. If you're able to maintain and establish that capacity, I think tariff policy may work out well. But if not, then I think we will see a bigger impact.
Remains to be seen. The first 100 days are going to be interesting. That's if he can make any headway in that first 100 days. That's what he's shooting for. My guess is that he's either going to implement that or he's not. So let's move on to something else. Let's talk about the federal debt. Continues to grow with every new administration, despite campaign promises to lower it. No matter which side you're on, they're always talking about that. Any thoughts on what the Trump policies will do to the debt? And if you're scoring at home, it's about $36 trillion last I checked. That's $106,000 for every single person in America. Chris?
Yeah, huge problem. And the annual budget deficit's a big problem too, because the federal government's scheduled this year to spend about $2 trillion more than what's bringing in terms of tax revenues, and they'll just get tacked onto the national debt. And that's when the economy is healthy. For all intents and purposes, the economy is at full employment right now, the unemployment rate hovering right around 4%. So usually when the economy is strong like it is right now, the budget deficit shrinks because tax revenues are strong, plus spending on things like unemployment insurance goes down. The idea is small budget deficit or a surplus during an economic expansion like we have right now, so that when there's a recession in the future, you can run a budget deficit. And then over the life of the business cycle, the budget balances out. So it's really disconcerting to think that in a healthy economy right now, we have a record high budget deficit of $2 trillion because there will be a recession at some point in the future. How big does the budget deficit get at that point? $3 trillion, $4 trillion? At some point, you have to worry about, well, if the Treasury Department is trying to sell $2 to $3 trillion worth of Treasury securities, which is how the federal government borrows, is the appetite of the bond market going to start to dry up for these treasuries to say, we've loaned the federal government enough money, we're starting to question the federal government's ability to repay what it's borrowed. If the federal government ever exhausts its ability to borrow, we're going to have a real problem on our hands. I think that's a big risk moving forward. But in terms of short to medium run, anything that we do to cut taxes, like President Trump has talked about not taxing tips, extending his 2017 tax cuts, that just adds the annual budget deficit, which gets tacked onto the national debt.
Shay, any follow-up to that?
I mean, the one follow would be spending has been an issue for each administration. And I believe the intent of each administration is to find a way or find a solution to control spending or control debt. I'll always put it as an example of, okay, your intent is to clear your credit card debt, but just because your lifestyle has been so luxurious, you need to keep adding more credit cards and you keep piling up more debt because you have to figure out a way to sustain the lifestyle. And the lifestyle in terms of the US is we have massive infrastructure that needs spending each year to maintain the standards that we have. The question is, where do we cut? And I think that has been the battle of two political philosophies. How do we cut? Should we cut through income tax or should we cut through other means? And hence, I believe the appetite for the consumers, for the vote bank, to look at an example of Trump's idea of imposing tariffs that may increase some sort of revenue stream or U.S. ability to generate another tier of income. But the question is, at this point of time, no one has a clear indication of how to clear or how to cut spending that will help us decrease our debt. But one thing is for sure is that there are a lot of communities in Michigan in particular, for instance, mid-sized cities that are still trying to figure out how to recover from COVID. And if there's any recession down the road, as Professor mentioned, then there's always a cycle of boom and burst. We won't be able to sustain some of the communities that rely on statewide or federal funding. So it is a concern for Trump's administration, and then they need to be more clear as to what type of solutions they are willing to offer, not just rhetoric.
Yeah, you both brought up the dreaded R word, recession, and I think there's a lot of us that think that window has passed. They thought that we were going to be in a recession in the last year and a half, and it never fully took. So are you guys maybe still seeing that could be in play? Given the stock market in 24 was up 25%. So I'll let you handle that.
Yeah, the thing with recessions is that they happen with very little warning. If you go back to December 2007, people were really optimistic about what 2008 and 2009 looked like. You didn't really see anyone raising the alarm that, well, hey, come early 2008, all bets are off. It's going to be the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, but that's exactly what happened. Same with COVID. People are really optimistic. In January 2020, the unemployment rate's below 4% for the first time since the financial crisis. 2020 is looking great. All of a sudden, COVID hits, the economy shuts down, and we have the worst recession since the Great Depression. You could go back to every recession, at least since World War II, and those recessions happen with very little warning, which is why it's so difficult to forecast a recession. I'm not expecting a recession in 2025, but just given the history, you can't rule it out because something could just happen and all of a sudden it's off to the races with a recession.
And the recipe for a recession is what? You've got to see what? That it becomes officially a recession.
So traditionally it's 2 consecutive quarters of declining gross domestic product, meaning a decline in the production of goods and services. That happened in the first half of 2022. People use the term technical recession because sure, that met the definition of a recession, but otherwise the economy was healthy. So the economic group, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which tries to figure out when recessions begin and end, said that, well, we don't think the economy's in a recession. That was probably the right call because the unemployment rate didn't spike, jobs weren't lost, and that's really what happens during a recession, which is why recessions are so bad because the economy goes from being good to really bad basically overnight. The unemployment rate goes from, say, 4% up to 10% with very little room in between. It's like once that light switch goes off, jobs get lost very quickly and the unemployment rate spikes.
Shay, any more to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the technical recession that Professor is mentioning, in my view, it was downplayed a bit because, I mean, if you have 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline, I think that is technically a recession. But there were so many other economic indicators around the same time that many anticipated to show some negativity around it, but it did not happen. For instance, when those 2 quarters passed, there was some anticipation in the auto industry that new vehicle sales might go down, but it did not happen. There was anticipation that the retail sales across the country would take a hit. That did not happen. Auto dealers across the country continue to make profits. What also suggested that there is some appetite for consumers to keep active or stay active in the market. So that was actually the 2022, 2021. Those 2 years were so interesting because if those years happened in a different era, we would likely have seen some sort of economic meltdown, but that did not happen. One key thing that was also noted that consumers wanted to buy new houses, but then there were not enough in supply, and interest rates were high for them to stay out of the housing market. So those two quarters that Professor mentioned were interesting, and hence I believe what we noted last year during election time, when despite the economy being somewhat stable, there was some frustration within masses about how their pockets are looking, their ability to afford or maintain the lifestyle that they once afforded before COVID, for instance, was not possible anymore. Many households are still struggling. And I think that was translated into the idea of embracing a candidate who may have some disruptive policies, but then if this is something they agree upon, then let them be it.
Great. Well, Shay, I'm going to stick with you as we segue into sort of the Federal Reserve and what they might do with interest rates. been wrestling with this for about 2 years. When inflation was running at about 10%, I think the feds were trying to play around with that to see if they could drive inflation down. Any sense of what you think the feds plan to do, where you see those inflation numbers going? So it's like a twofold question. What the feds are going to do, what do you think it might do with inflation?
Yeah, in my view, I think the so let's put it this way: the inflation averaged nearly 5% in the past few years. If you look at the average, so that means the impact of inflation on households' ability to purchase goods remains impacted. So the question is Fed going to look at it and then see, and other factors to see if this could be reversed by cutting interest rates again. If that's the case, then it may ease up some of consumers' ability to access goods again. But the key thing is how Trump's administration is going to see that as a policy coming out of Fed. I think his views are pretty clear that there needs to be some heightened say of president in Fed's decisions. So that could play some role. But I think they will continue to cut the interest rates.
So, Chris, I'm sure you can follow up that. And the other question that I would have for you is that, to clarify, define for us sort of what the role, the job of the Federal Reserve is anyway. And some have said, do they have too much power to sort of move the dial on this sort of thing?
So the Federal Reserve has what's called a dual mandate, where they're charged to keep the unemployment rate low and keep prices stable, which means low inflation. So we can, conclusively say the Federal Reserve failed that second part of the dual mandate during COVID by letting inflation spike at 10%. Even right now, inflation is coming down, but it's still elevated. The Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target, which means prices up across the board increasing by 2% year to year in the economy. But inflation is running closer to 3% right now. So you might say, and I would agree with this, that the Federal Reserve cut interest rates too quickly, because traditionally when interest rates are cut, inflation goes up. So the Federal Reserve is trying to drive the unemployment rate down. They're not as concerned with inflation, so they cut interest rates to try to push the unemployment rate down and maybe tolerate higher inflation. But right now it's the opposite. Unemployment's at 4%. Inflation is elevated at close to 3%, so the Federal Reserve should be increasing interest rates to try to reduce inflation, but they're not. They're cutting. To me, that feels premature, but I think there's a real third mandate for the Federal Reserve that's not talked about, which should be, because I think the real mandate for the Federal Reserve is to cheaply finance the federal government. And when we're talking about a $2 trillion annual budget deficit and a $36 trillion national debt, the federal government is financing itself on the equivalent of an adjustable rate mortgage, because every time interest rates go up, that makes it more expensive for the federal government to borrow every year, and it makes it more expensive to roll over the debt and issue new debt for the part of the national debt that comes due. So right now, the federal government is scheduled to spend $1.4 trillion just making interest payments every year on the national debt. That's more than the defense budget, which is about $800 billion. It's more than Social Security, which is just under $1.4 trillion. It's more than Medicare. And that's money the federal government can't not spend, because if the federal government fails to make those interest payments, that triggers a hard default on the debt, which would cause a massive financial crisis. So when you're spending nearly $1.5 trillion on interest payments on the national debt, the federal government can't afford higher interest rates, which is why I think the real motivation for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates is to relieve that pressure on the federal budget in terms of the amount of interest the federal government is paying.
Interesting. I'm going to segue into energy policy. President Trump has talked about drill, baby, drill, right? Because he feels like we should be more independent in terms of our energy, which on one hand is okay, but that's also kind of a blow to the folks that are supporting the Green New Deal. So any thoughts from either of you, what we might see from an energy policy and what that may mean for our future, becoming independent, if we get away from sort of the Green New Deal, those kind of things?
Yeah, I certainly think Trump would drill everywhere that he could. This week, President Biden took some Arctic offshore drilling off the table, and apparently that's difficult for whatever reason for Trump to undo. I think Also, President Trump starts to scale back the electric vehicle subsidies. Famously, there was $40 billion spent to establish charging stations across the U.S., but no charging stations were apparently built. But a lot of the automakers, General Motors in particular, said that we're going to be fully electric by the early 2030s. I think on the understanding that there'd be this real federal support to make that transition. But if that federal support disappears, I think we'll see that shift towards EVs stopping. And I think there will be a push to expand oil and gas production, wherever feasible, either on private lands or federal lands.
Shay, any thoughts on that, where we're going with that in the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think compared to Biden, Trump's, at least in his second term, he might bring a more balanced approach towards focusing on the traditional industry, as well as ensuring that the EV industry doesn't die down. Yes, manufacturers made ambitious goals that backfired. Some of the ideas that the Biden administration wanted to pursue, that doesn't work out anymore through the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. We noted that in the past few quarters, even though the EV or the battery electric sales are increasing, but they are not increasing at a pace that the current administration, which is the Biden administration, hoped for. But that doesn't mean that the demand for the EV products are coming down. What we have also noted that in the past few quarters, manufacturers outside of the big three have started to see some increase in sales within the EV products. What that means is there is a steady appetite, but not a strong desire to quickly transition from traditional model to an EV. What that may suggest is that if any incoming administration, if they maintain a balance between two policies, it would help them cater to both audiences. And I believe there's an appetite for an EV as well as internal combustion engine vehicles.
We'll get there eventually. It's a hard sell for the moment, but we're in for a big change. Shay, Chris, thanks a lot. Good work. I'll bring you back in about 6 months and see how the forecast played out. Appreciate it.
Sounds good.
And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next Tuesday night for the follow-up. Significant increase in the minimum wage and paid sick time will be our issue next week. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Well, welcome to the follow-up after show, kind of our web extra, the viewers that watch the big live show. Now it's an opportunity to talk about some things that maybe we didn't get to in the big show with some new information with our guests that were in the live show. Chris Douglas, economics professor with the University of Michigan-Flint, and Shay Manawar with the Lansing Economic Development Corporation. He is a development specialist. So prior to the show, we produced a couple of graphics that kind of compared the last few administrations from Obama, Trump's first term, to Biden when it comes to the economy. So let's run through that. We've got a couple of those. The first one is sort of the U.S. unemployment rate and the employment rate. And there they are, as you can see, going from Obama through Trump to Biden, and then unemployment, Obama, Trump, and Biden. And you can see the spikes one way or another compared to the unemployment based on COVID. So Chris, maybe you can take a run at that. What does that tell you a little bit? So if you look at Obama to Trump, it looks like it's just a continuous line. But Obama's 2010 number starts right after the financial crisis, where a lot of jobs were lost. A lot of those jobs have rebounded. So by 2018, 2019, the economy is back at what's called full employment, which means everyone who wants a job could largely find one. And then unfortunately, with COVID, total employment drops off a cliff, 20 million jobs lost. That's basically 20 years of job growth. So those jobs come roaring back once the economy reopens. Biden took lots of credit for that job growth, but those were rebound jobs, basically the government saying you're allowed to go back to work again and then counting those as brand new jobs created. But if you look at that 158.7 million number, and you just draw a line from Obama to Trump to that number, that line would look pretty level. Right.
Which means that total employment is caught up back up to trend. meaning we are where we would be had COVID not happened.
Shay, do you want to follow up there? What do you see there?
Yeah, and everything that Professor said, it's something I agree with. If we can add one more layer to this analysis, is that the U.S. employment, which is 158.7 million, represents share of both private sector and public sector employment. So there is a growing concern that the U.S. employment includes a lot more government sector employment compared to the private sector. Various factors, but is it something we should see it as a healthy sign or otherwise? And I'll leave that to the audience. So that's one thing I noted.
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic when you look at it between those three administrations. And so, Shay, I'll stay with you. We're going to show the viewers something on wages and the inflation. And if we can throw that up, you can see that. Same sort of dramatic spikes from one of the Obama to Trump. Wages obviously were up in the Trump administration, then COVID hits, goes down. You want to do some perspective on what you see there, Shay?
Yeah, and if you look at the U.S. inflation first, the impact of the near 9% inflation during the Biden administration impacted the U.S. wages on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, every time there's inflation, some sectors do tend to increase or adjust their wages for the employees accordingly. Some don't. And then we typically see an impact of inflation on the wages that typically people generate from their jobs, how much those wages impact their household budgets. And if that happens, especially after a couple of drastic years of high inflation, we do see, despite increase in wages, people's ability to afford certain basket of goods diminish. So while we do see high wages, that doesn't mean that my ability to purchase more goods have increased.
See anything else there, Chris?
Yeah, a couple things real quickly. If you look at the inflation rate, 2.9%, that sounds low on the surface, but if you look at both Obama and Trump, inflation is hovering right around 2%. So 2.9% is quite a bit elevated compared to 2%, which is why during the regular show I said that I thought the Federal Reserve cut rates too quickly. If you look at U.S. wages, that spike in 2020, that's due to the COVID stimulus, where I forget exactly how much it was. Everyone got a $1,400 check, I think.
Right, that's it.
So if you kind of discount that big spike in 2020 and just look at the trend of Obama and Trump, wages were steadily increasing. So just take that 2017 to 2019 trend and just extend that line upward. You could say, well, that's where we would be in 2024 had COVID not happened, all else equal. So if you would extend that line upward, you would see that would be quite a bit higher compared to where we are right now in 2024. And these are wages adjusted for inflation, which gets back to Shay's point in that inflation really has hit the consumer hard because wages haven't caught up to where they would have been had the inflation not set in, which is why when you looked at one of the major issues in the 2024 presidential campaign, according to the Gallup poll, inflation was right at the top of the list because it's not like consumers are exactly flush with cash before inflation hit. And now with inflation, their wages just with that much less far.
Okay. And I'll stick with you, Chris, for our last graphic. This is going to be on sort of economic growth, GDP, stock market growth, comparing, I think in this case, Trump's first term with Biden, who's about to finish his only term. What are those numbers, what do those graphs say to you, Chris?
Yeah, so it's interesting that the stock market was relatively flat during Biden's term, which I think is indicative of inflation kind of stressing the consumer pocketbook, as well as supply chain disruptions, which makes it harder for firms to produce final goods. And we see the stock market really increase after the election. And it's hard to know exactly why the stock market does what it does.
Yeah.
Part of it might be the market likes President Trump's economic ideas, maybe the tax cuts. I think the market's probably less thrilled with the idea of tariffs, but maybe the market really thinks that, well, the tariffs are mostly posturing. We're not going to really see a 25% tariff. Could also be that the election was very decisive. We didn't have a prolonged fight, which is what something people worried about.
Mm-hmm.
The stock market does like uncertainty. And then in terms of economic growth, growth doesn't look super great over the last 2 to 3 years. It's okay, but it's just kind of where it was before COVID.
Right.
And there you can see in 2022 that technical recession we talked about in the regular show, where we had 2 consecutive quarters of declining or of negative growth. And then you can see, of course, the impact of the lockdowns, where if the economy shuts down, it's impossible to produce goods and services, which results in a big economic contraction.
Shay, you want to add to that? Kind of a last word on our conversation for the after show, looking at that last graph and get your thoughts.
Yes, please. Yep. If you look at the U.S. economic growth, the GDP each quarter, I mean, both administrations have had more quarters that saw growth. Yet both presidents lost, were made to lose their elections after the first term. But what that may suggest is that I think we now have to look at how consumers, a typical American, looks at the economy. They may not look at a small or any sizable growth in GDP as something to satisfy them easily. They want certain changes in how their household incomes and household lifestyles have been impacted over the course of multiple generations. I think that was one thing that brought Trump back to the White House, is that economic analysis do tend to tell us a lot, but that doesn't mean that it has been impacting many household lives positively for multiple generations. And so I think we just have to look at these charts maybe a few years from now and see how people will react again, because the times have changed. I think we cannot use the same handbook that we've been using over the past couple of decades. Hence the appetite or the demand to come up with something new and different is on a high, and then we would see that.
Yeah, remains to be seen, right? He's promising a big change. The electorate pretty much are backing him in a big way, looking for a big economic change for the positive, and that first 100 days is really going to say a lot, I think. So, Shay Manawar, Chris Douglas, thanks again. Appreciate your perspective, and appreciate you joining us on the After Show.
Always great to be here.
And thank you for joining us. Have a great night.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.